Okay, good. So yes, hello everyone. My name is Jeremiah Morgan. I am a senior security analyst for SA Labs and been there for about 4 years. What's interesting about that is that this is my only tech role. And my experience beforehand kind of inspired this talk because I had some sort of anecdotal story where, long story short, I realized that despite the fact that I had no technical background whatsoever before starting SC Labs, I had just as much standing as people who had master degrees in cybersecurity. And I just wanted to discuss why that was the case. Why is it that I would have as much capabilities of fulfilling actual job related roles than someone who's done a master's in cybersecurity? With that said, a couple of things I want to say first before I get started. Like, I'm not saying that you should not go to do a degree in cybersecurity or similar. I'm not saying that these are completely worthless. All I'm saying, and what I'll discuss today, is the fact that maybe something needs to be done to close the gap between a graduate going into cybersecurity and then realizing, oh, wait a minute, I don't know how to do my job, and this is an entry level position. Another point I want to make up before I start, apart from the fact that my slides are not as pretty as Nemi's. So yeah, I'm sorry for that. It's the fact that this is all UK-based stuff, but it's not specific to the UK. This is very prevalent in the US, for example, and I've noticed in certain parts of Latin America and Asia, this is the case too. The reasons are really different between each country. But as you'll see in today's presentation, this is specifically for the UK, but just bear in mind, this isn't exclusively to the UK. And finally, speaking of which, I will be using UK spellings. If you use US spellings, don't worry, it'll all be obvious. So I first want to make my case as to why this is an important thing to talk about. As you may imagine, the cybersecurity industry is an ever-growing industry, and as a result of that, more and more cybersecurity professionals are necessary. It's found that in the past 5 years, it's been growing by about 15% over the past 5 years, where we needed more professionals in mostly entry-level roles, but sometimes mid-level and expert roles as well. And specifically, it's found that there's a shortage despite this need for professionals at a rate of around just over 111,000 roles per year. And so what seems to be the case is that, like, it's up to universities mostly to try to fix this gap by teaching what would be future cybersecurity professionals to fill in that gap. And this is what the situation is right now. So half of UK businesses have what's called a basic level skill gap for cybersecurity, and about a third for advanced. And what this basically means is that 50% of people who come into an entry level role struggle to do their job. And about a third of people who go to the more experienced and advanced role struggle to do their job to some way or another. And again, it's nothing to do with the fact that they're incompetent or don't know what they're doing. It's the fact that based on university credentials solely, they are not taught the specific day-to-day duties necessary for the actual roles. So stuff like incident response, security operations center operations, threat intelligence, things like that are not really taught to recent graduates, at least not to the level where they can be competent immediately. And so what tends to be the case is that a lot of companies are realizing that, yes, you do have to train your workers in a job role. That's true, because it's every company works differently. You do have to do some sort of training, but what they're finding out is that they have to do more training than they realize. So they're using up a lot more time, a lot more money, a lot more resources to be teaching these recent graduates who was assumed to have known to do certain things to then be taught how to do those certain things, if that makes sense. So let's talk about the disconnect and where this disconnect comes from. So what I did in preparation for this presentation is that I looked into as many UK both bachelor's and master degrees as I could to see what the pattern was, where this is coming from. And I noticed that there were three main types of degrees that fit in this sort of category. The first one, where it's almost predominantly computer science based. Maybe it will have like a module here there with cybersecurity, but it's mostly computer science based. I mention that because there's a lot of job roles where some of the criteria is that they want you to have a computer science degree rather than a cybersecurity one specifically, despite the fact that it is a cybersecurity role. The second one is where it's a joint one, where it's computer science and cybersecurity, sorry, where it's still based on computer science, but in the context of cybersecurity, like how do you mostly stuff like DevOps and things of that nature. And finally, there's the third point where it's mostly just cybersecurity. These are mostly master level qualifications, but they do some bachelors as well. And that's predominantly cybersecurity based, but that still has an issue too. And why is consistent with all of these 3 points, all of these 3 types of degrees, is that it's predominantly theory based. It's a lot of this is how this works, this is the theory into it, write a report on it, go. Do the thing, do the report. And that's okay. It's important to know these things. You do have to start somewhere. You can't just be told, hey, set up this server if you don't know what a server is and how that works and some of the terminology involved. My point is that there's too much of an emphasis towards the theory-based things compared to the practical side of things. And the second main element of a degree, and this is predominant in master degree specifically, is that they offer what I call increasingly niche courses. And the purpose of this is to specialize in certain tools. I'll talk into what those specializations are. But in a sense, what this means is that there'll be elements of a cybersecurity course where they want to delve deeper into one specific element. So the result of this is that despite all of this information, despite the theories, despite this specialization, despite the niche insights, basic entry-level duties such as log analysis, incident response, network traffic, proficiency with SIEM tools, and everything that will be associated with those things are severely lacking. And about half of businesses are realizing that these are severely lacking. And as a result, what is assumed to be already present in a recent graduate is not there. They don't know how to do these things. You could throw a SIEM in front of them and you'd assume they'd know because they've done a master's in cybersecurity, and they don't know what they're looking at. They've never seen this before. And this has become well, I say increasingly, but it had been increasing in the past 5 years, where more and more companies are realizing, well, this is a bit of an issue now, where we're struggling to find people who know these sorts of things. And the kind of people that do are people who depend on a university degree solely. So let's have a deeper look into what the typical curriculum is. Again, this is just a generalization and just some of the common trends that are found in a lot of the degrees that are available in the UK. But again, this is sort of the same thing across the world as well. Some of the fundamentals is like cryptography, network security, risk management, and governance. It's not solely these things, but there's a lot of other major elements of cybersecurity that many of you may think, well, that's cool to know to begin with, but what else is there? The problem is there is nothing else. And again, it's not just these 4 things. There's a lot of things as well. And it's okay to know these things. It's important to know these things. It's not to say that no one should be learning these things, but there's nothing here in these modules, as far as I've seen, that isn't going beyond the theory behind cryptography by the sample. So in other words, there's no instance of how it does cryptography appear in the workforce, for example, and what does that actually entail? And we're still, when I talked about niches and specialization, the 3 most popular ones, and Nima will be happy to see this, is artificial intelligence is one, but also IoTs is one, and blockchain is another one. These are the 3 elements that a lot of these universities and the education sector for tech in general, I realize that are the most important things to focus on. And again, that's really good, because this is something that will need to be focused on in one way or another, and it is prevalent in the world today now. The problem is that it's very entry level, as it were. So like I said, if it's not theory based, then at best it's case study based. And again, that's great in a sense of, well, at least you're using real world examples as to how cryptography works or how IoT gets affected in the real world. That's really wonderful stuff. The problem is, again, is that yes, you can learn about how these things happened, like in retrospect, but how do you protect about that against that? How do you notice that when these things are happening, like a security breach, for example? How do you notice that that is happening as it's happening, or before or afterwards? There's nothing in this curriculum that prepares a graduate in understanding how to protect about these things, just that they basically exist. And it's with the specialization as well. Again, it's one of those things where, yes, it's good to know about IoTs and artificial intelligence. But if no one understands just exactly why it works the way that it does, or some of the more practical uses of AI in penetration testing, for example, then again, the graduate is, it's even worse because the graduate is left to believe that they do know exactly what they're doing because these things are being touched on and they are being put into this niche. But what they realize is that once they're in the workplace environment, and they're told what their duties are, and it doesn't fit what they've been learning, suddenly they don't feel confident in their own abilities, even if they would or otherwise be qualified to do those roles and would quickly pick those up. It's one of those instances where they've gone to university to specifically prepare themselves for at least an entry level role, and they've realized, wait a minute, I don't know anything. And so companies, well, I should put an asterisk on this final point at the bottom because it's kind of an issue where companies don't really care too much about the fact that you have a degree. They do, but it's more of a basic level thing when it comes to getting into cybersecurity. And it's one of those things where it's important because you need what's called certifications. A degree by itself is not going to get you far in cybersecurity. And so certifications fill that skill-based gap, at least they attempt to do so. And so stuff like the CompTIA, the Cisco-based ones, and other Quest accredited certifications aim to try to fill in the gap between the theory that a student will learn from university and some of the more practical uses of that skill set. Again, it's very varied. There's a lot of options, which is beneficial, as we touch on soon. But it's good in the sense that it's not the only thing a student can depend on in terms of learning more information about how to do their specific role. And besides then, there's other platforms like Try Hack Me that we have over here and Hack the Box, which is like in many cases free platforms that anyone, literally anyone, whether you're doing a degree or not, could go on to. And first of all, they can contemplate whether what they even want to get into cybersecurity, and if they do, what segment of cybersecurity they would like to get into. So, for example, if I'm thinking, oh, I want to be a penetration tester, but I don't know how to use Linux, I could go on to Try Hack Me or Hack the Box and go into the Linux fundamentals room, for example, which is free to use, and learn the basics of using Linux before moving on to using Kali and using some of the tools available there. And again, this is all free stuff. And that includes Kali Linux, for example, that's free to use. Using VirtualBox to make your virtual environments, that's free to use. And that ties in with my final point on this slide with being a hobbyist with these sorts of things. Because one of the most beneficial parts of cybersecurity is self-learning. And one big element of that is going out and trying these things for yourself. And it's very helpful that a lot of these things that you can do are free to use and readily available for a lot of cases, not to the extent you may want to learn exactly how to work in an entry level role, but it's enough for you to have some sort of like understanding as to what the actual duties of a work environment may entail. So why would someone choose a certification over higher education? Well, as I said before in a couple of slides ago, not every company really cares too much if you have a degree per se. A lot of them do just as a benchmark, but if you had an equivalent certification, they would prefer that. And indeed, 60% of UK postings have certifications, and they a lot of the times they have both. And this is especially true when it comes to everything above entry level. It's very difficult, as I said earlier, almost impossible, I would say, to make it in a high position in cybersecurity without at least one other certification proving that you can do one of a specific thing, whether it's networking or penetration testing or what have you. And as a result, because cybersecurity is so broad, the choices available are broad. So again, if you want to specialize in this particular field, there's specific certifications that you can focus on to make sure that you have the correct knowledge and the correct mindset to able to do those roles, so you can grow as a person and you can grow as a cybersecurity professional. There is one small itty bitty problem with this, however, and it's this. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this screen before, but what you're looking at is 481 available certifications between different parts of cybersecurity. Now, credit to one called Paul Jeremy, who made this himself and put it on his website. I'll show the link to that later on. But what's helpful about this, to be fair, is that, again, if you want to understand what certification you want to get into in order to reach a certain point for certain aspects of cybersecurity, at least you can use this. And the good thing about this website is that it's interactive. You can click on one of them and it'll tell you the price of each one, as well as send you to a link to that certification. But as you could imagine, even looking at this, even with the information at hand, there's too many options. Like, picture a recent graduate, you've just finished university, you're looking for your first cybersecurity role, and you're beginning to realize, or maybe you already realized, that you need certification to get anywhere in the position you want to get into. Even with this in mind, this is confusing. But imagine if someone didn't have this. Imagine if someone was just told, oh, like you have to do this, but there's also that, and maybe you could do this, and that you could also do that if you want to. It's very confusing for the recent graduate to even consider which qualification they should go to. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not to say that every qualification that you see, every certification that you see here is on equal footing to others. Some are more credited than others. Some are more sought after than others. Some turn up on job postings more than others. That is true. But by and large, never mind the fact that a student may not even realize or even comprehend which the part of cybersecurity they even want to get into. Once they do have an understanding, it's confusing as to which part of which certification does it go to first. And so you just have this like overload of certifications, and like I said before, it's something that you need multiple of. It's not just you can say, oh, I'm going to do the OSCP for penetration testing, for example, and that'll be enough. It could be enough if that's all you want to do, but you would still need to do other certifications to even know how to do the OSCP to begin with. And so even if you want to do even more than that, there's even more certification. And if you want to change to a different department, you have to change to different ones too. And it's just very confusing for the average person, regardless if they had this thing in front of them or not. And so what you tend to have is that besides all of what I mentioned before, it's a lot of these certifications have the same issues with higher education. And by that, I mean, it's very theory-based. It's very case study based. It's a lot of this is what this is. This is the name of this. This is what happens when you connect this to this, and nothing really practical that the recent graduate can use to actually adopt a skill set that would be useful in the workforce. And as I mentioned before, some are more credited than others. And what you get as a result is that some standards are just inconsistent. You could like do a certification and be left in the same position that you were in when you like graduating with cybersecurity, having no clue how to do the job at hand. So what's the solution? Well, some courses, thankfully, I found, actually do virtual labs in the same guise as Hack the Box and Try Hack Me, where they actually use practical examples of this is how you hack into a system, for example, or how this is how you use a SIEM, this is how you protect a network, this is how you do risk assessment, for example, actual practical experience. A lot of these experiences that you would actually really use in once you get your first role in cybersecurity. Another point I would like is that if a lot of these universities would emphasize more on commonly used tools, again, it's not every company is going to be using every tool in every way, but there are some basic ones like Wireshark, which is predominantly used in a lot of instances, and or use how to use a SIEM in general is something that will be worth knowing. Even if it's not the same as the one you'll be working with, just interacting with one at all will be enough between one student who hasn't done it before and one that has to help them perform better in their workforce. And one other thing I thought would be interesting, and this does occur in other industries, is that why don't we have embedded certification more often? It does happen in a lesser extent in cybersecurity. But for example, before I got into SC Labs, into tech, I was an English language tutor and I graduated in English language and teaching. But as part of that degree, I got what's called a TEFL certificate. And what that means is that not only do I have the degree, which is required to teach, to tutor English as a foreign language, I have the TEFL certification to say, yes, I can teach English to people learning English as a second language abroad if I wish to. And it may be helpful, although not necessarily possible in every sense. It would be helpful if some universities had this sort of accredited certification, considering how a lot of them are very like mandatory for a lot of entry level positions. Maybe it will help that student to have a footing in the door for a job position, and more importantly, understand what it is exactly is expected of them once they start their entry level cybersecurity role. And my final point is that maybe they should offer a bigger insight. They do this, but I feel they should give a bigger insight into what red teaming is, for example, what blue teaming is, for example, and not just like a basic description like, oh, red team is offensive and blue teaming is defensive, but it's more about understanding what that actually entails. What will you actually be doing as a penetration tester? What will you be doing as a SOC analyst? What will you be doing as like working with CMs and all those other things, rather than just giving a theoretical description of each of those two things and more besides? Because of course, cybersecurity isn't just about blue teaming and red teaming after all. But it's not all bad. The good thing is that at least on entry level, the skill gap is falling. So whatever we're doing at the moment is sort of working. It's still really high, around 44%, which is still almost half. But as of last year, it's continued to go down. And if projections for next year are to correct, it won't be on the same trajectory, but it will continue to go down. And the same for advanced. What's interesting about this is that the report I got this from, which I'll talk about later, is that they categorize these in different elements, in different aspects. So like normal businesses have gone down, public sector has gone down, but charities oddly has gone up after it went down the year before. And we don't really fully know why. But according to the result, this is just an aside, by the way, but according to this report by the UK government, they found that charities are more likely to hire one person to do the entire security detail, and they're more likely to not see cybersecurity as that important. It's that old mantra where smaller companies, smaller businesses and charities and things like that seem to think that, oh, we're not a big company, we're not a big target. And it's the same issue here again, where no, quite the opposite. You're an easy target, if anything else. And it's a shame that although the public sector and businesses are really understanding this, charities are kind of falling behind in that regard. But at the same time, more does need to be done. What you're looking at in your screen right now are two different charts that show the confidence level in the workplace. The one on the left shows the confidence level of a cybersecurity professional when it comes to how confident they are to provide training for people who are not into cybersecurity or work in other fields, and more importantly, how confident they are to talk about security risks to the directors or upper management, basically. And as you can see, especially with the last point, there's an issue where a lot of professionals don't feel confident enough to say, hey, I found a risk. I need to tell the director or the CTO or something like that. And of course, what happens as a result is that things that should have been fixed quickly or quicker aren't fixed as quickly because the person who found the risk doesn't believe that in their capabilities good enough to believe that this is actually a risk and it's not just them making a mistake. And on the right, this is a more condensed look into the different elements of, this is mostly blue team related stuff, to be fair, but it's more about protecting access and all the different elements of that. And as you look, the further down you go, the more severe the results are. So of course, like creating backups is a very basic thing. It like everyone, even people who are not into cybersecurity, understand that hey, it's safe, it's relevant, and it's necessary to create a backup of your assets. But not everyone knows how to deal with a security breach, and it's very telling that the percentages of people who are at least very competent or fairly confident that they'll be able to deal with a cybersecurity breach is fairly is much lower than creating a backup. Of course, one is easier than the other, but it would stand to reason that you would want that confidence level to go higher. Excuse me. And the other point here is that this is a perceived look at advanced security specifically to people who are not in cybersecurity, or, for example, who are not cybersecurity professionals. And as you see, it's very low. Like even the ones that are going up is still no higher than just over 25%. And what that basically means is that there's a there's a stigma almost where a lot of companies, even if they do see it as some sort of important, it's not important enough to them. To people outside of cybersecurity, I mean, so people who work in finance, maybe, or people who work in HR, or any other department that doesn't deal with the security aspects of a company, they, by and large, don't seem to understand how important cybersecurity is for the business. And of course, as you could imagine, larger businesses in the public sector see this as important, but it's still really low. It's still something that we still need to work on. And it's one of those things where, like, if you couple this notion where a company doesn't feel it's important enough to invest into the cybersecurity detail, and you're hiring people who aren't confident in their security skill set, you're going to have an issue. And so you all agree. So, in conclusion, as I mentioned before, the industry is growing. It is a bigger thing, and it still continues to grow. But as a result, despite the fact that you think, well, this just means there's more jobs for everyone, what is actually turning out to be the case is that the standards of the professionals in question are middling at best. And that's not to say that's their fault. It's not their fault at all. It's the fault of the university degrees that give them the impression that they're going to be prepared for the role, and then realizing that this is not the case at all. But at the same time, it's not to say that universities are completely at fault too. They do have to fulfill a curriculum after all. And more importantly, there's only so much you can fit into a course. But at the same time, there should be a bigger emphasis on the idea that a university degree is not enough by its own. I mean, that should be the case in any industry, but it's especially true in a ever-growing, ever-changing, ever-evolving industry as cybersecurity. And so what I feel is the best course of action is a combination of everything. So doing your degree if you want to, although I would argue personally that it's not that necessary to do a university degree if you don't feel the need to. But certification is definitely important, and stuff like doing platforms like TrackHackery and doing stuff in your own time is definitely going to help you towards getting a better position in cybersecurity as a recent graduate. And that is my talk. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. Before you jump in, John, just a couple of points first. The first highlighted link is of this security roadmap, certification roadmap. So anyone who's interested in looking into that can look that up themselves and interact with that. And where I get most of my stats from is from the second highlighted site, where it's the UK government annual review on cybersecurity and different elements in that. And it talks about other things as well, like diversity in cybersecurity role, or like confidence levels, as I talked about before, and every other element that you may find interesting. But that was my talk. Thank you very much.